One of the most famous works of fiction of the 20th century is George Orwell's 1984. I'm sure many of you have read it. I first read it in high school in the 1970s, as it was one of the books we were assigned in history. I read it again a couple of years ago when Mrs. Orsum bought me a dual copy of 1984 An Animal Farm with an introduction by the late great Christopher Hitchens. Of course, one of the great risks you run if you're going to write a novel about a possible dystopian future is how it will stand the test of time in regard to its accuracy. In that sense, Orwell's 1984 is eerily prophetic, as many of the things he wrote about have come true, or come true in part. His accuracy in predicting the future is most likely the main reason why the book has become so famous. Notwithstanding, some of the things that have come true because Orwell wrote about them, and these should be delineated from the things Orwell predicted that were not direct manifestations of the book itself. For example, many newspeak words exist in common usage these days, not because Orwell predicted that they would, but because people were inspired to create them and use them because they read 1984. This video is about some of his prophecies. Even those who haven't read 1984, or young adults and teenagers who, for whatever reason, may have never heard of it, will still most likely know of the most famous of 1984 axioms, that of Big Brother, and the idea that Big Brother is watching you. At the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, there were only around 20,000 televisions in all of the UK, and the BBC suspended television until after the war's end in 1945. Orwell was already dead before television began to become commonplace throughout the UK in the 1950s. Orwell's idea of the telescreen that could watch you as well as you watch it is prophetic beyond belief, given that we now live in an age of CCTV video surveillance and smart TVs with built-in cameras that can collect data about what we watch. Orwell's Big Brother goes to the heart of the idea that society would ultimately sacrifice liberty for security. The argument being, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. But as we can now see happening, surveillance is being ever increasingly used to impose nanny statism, to regulate our behaviours. We are now entering the era of face recognition and being identified as individuals, not just members of the public. We are just one step away from Orwell's prediction of being watched at all times, even in the supposed privacy of our own homes, and having our actions constantly monitored, which will lead to no other place than the totalitarian control of what we will be allowed and not allowed to do. In Orwell's 1984, the citizens of Oceania are expected each day to attend the 2-minute hate. There is no specific law requiring attendance, but to not attend would be what we describe today as politically incorrect. A passage from the chapter regarding the 2-minute hate reads, "The horrible thing about the 2-minute hate was not that one was obliged to act a part, but that it was impossible to avoid joining in. Within 30 seconds, any pretense was always unnecessary. A hideous ecstasy of fear and vindictiveness, a desire to kill, to torture, to smash faces in with a sledgehammer, seemed to flow through the whole group of people like an electric current, turning one, even against one's will, into a grimacing, screaming lunatic. And yet the rage that one felt was an abstract, undirected emotion which could be switched from one object to another like the flame of a blow lamp. Our modern manifestation of the 2-minute hate is the social media, social justice hate mob, who through the suggestion of the mainstream media, analogous to the inner party of Oceania, who present the enemy of the people in a particular light to incite hatred of them, gather in their thousands on the internet to perform trial by social media on people they actually know nothing about, until the 2 minutes of fanaticism passes and they move on to the next victim. We see this all the time in our contemporary internet society. We can all think of any number of people who have been suddenly vilified beyond belief on the internet over supposed acts of thought crime, only to be completely forgotten about tomorrow. The enemy of the people in 1984 is Emmanuel Goldstein, who we know little about other than that he is a capitalist from one of the enemy states. Now, in 2018, we have our very own Goldstein in President Donald Trump, where Trump derangement syndrome is a real thing, whipped up by the mainstream media and exercised through social media to hate on Donald Trump with a passion, irrespective of anything he says or does.
This is what happens when you don't take your meds. This is why I don't believe in the legalization of marijuana.
It has to be a joke. I do not believe this is happening. I'm literally about to kill myself, and I'm not kidding.
In 1984, certain groups are established to help control the behaviour of the citizenry. One of those groups is the AntiSex League. Julia, the second character of the book, and who Winston forms a relationship with, is a member of the AntiSex League. It is the role of the AntiSex League to discourage sexual intimacy for any reason outside of procreation. Intimate and personal relationships are discouraged because they allow people to be reliant on one another, in contrast to the desire of the state for people to only love Big Brother and to place Big Brother above all others. Discouraging personal relationships also helps to manifest indifference to the suffering of others at those times that Big Brother is administering justice.
Room 101.
No. Please. You don't have to take me there. Why? There's nothing I won't confess. Nothing. I've told you everything already. What is it you want me to know? Take him instead of me. He's the thought criminal. It's him you want.
We see Orwell's prediction of an anti-sex league in third-wave feminism. The feminism of today is less concerned with empowering grid girls and sex workers, for example, to use their good looks and or sexuality for financial gain, than it is with the narrative that grid girls and sex workers represent the objectification of women by men and therefore must be stopped. Our contemporary anti-sex league, or what we call today sex-negative or Puritan feminism, seeks to undermine the natural attractiveness of men and women to each other and virtually criminalise, in particular, men's attraction to women. Ironically, Julia engages in a forbidden sexual relationship with Winston in direct contradiction to what is expected of her publicly, and even confides in him secretly that she hates the Anti-Sex League and Big Brother. Ultimately, the sexual relationship between them will see them apprehended by the thought police. In 1984, the gender differences between men and women are already long gone, and so his book doesn't reflect where we are today, as much as it reflects where we may be tomorrow, now that we have the gender police trying to erase those differences. In 1984, men and women wear blue, black or grey overalls, depending on your allocation, and thus there is no longer any expression or differentiation of masculinity or femininity in their appearance. In 2018, it's called being gender neutral, and the differences between men and women are portrayed as a bad thing.
When the orgasm has been finally eradicated, the last remaining obstacle to the psychological acceptance of the principles of INGSOC, as applied to ArtSem, will be overcome. In other words, the unorthodox tendencies towards own life, which constantly threaten the natural erosion of the family unit, will no longer have the biological support of the organism. As we all know, the biological and social stimulation of the family leads to private reflection outside party needs, and to the establishment of unorthodox loyalties which can only lead to thought crime. But the introduction of ArtSem, combined with the neutralization of the orgasm, will effectively render obsolete the family until it becomes impossible to conceptualize.
The man you saw before in this frame, begging not to be taken away, is Parsons, Winston's neighbour and friend of sorts. Parsons, having been permitted to marry for the purpose of reproduction, has what is described as a dull wife and ill-mannered children who are members of the junior spies. The junior spies are children who have been empowered by the state to expose any adults who may be guilty of thought crimes. In the previous scene, Parsons is being held in room 101 with Winston after having been turned in by his own children. Whilst he is frightened for his own fate, he is also paradoxically proud of his children for turning him in, for being good junior spies. Again, Orwell has foreseen a phenomenon that is taking place today. In the 1980s, we began to be told by the leftist pseudo-social scientists that it was abusive to discipline your children. Now in 2018 in Canada, if your child says, for whatever reason, that they identify as something other than their biological sex, and you don't support them in that belief or attempt to normalise their gender identity, the state can deem you as an abusive parent and remove your own child from your care. The child, who has none of the life experience and maturity to make decisions about what will really be in their own best interests, have dominion over their own parents in matters of guidance and discipline. A perfect scenario for the Marxist ideologue who wants to control them, regardless of what their parents think. In 1984, after Winston and Julia are apprehended by the Thought Police and Winston is taken to room 101, he is subjected to torture by electrocution by O'Brien. The purpose of the torture is to ensure that he believes in the mantra 2 + 2 = 5.
Do you remember writing in your diary, freedom is the freedom to say 2 + 2 = 4? How many fingers am I holding up, Winston?
4.
And if the party says there are not 4, but 5, then how many?
5.
No. That's no use. You're lying. Again. How many, Winston?
I don't know. I don't know.
Better.
In the recent video I did on Senator Fraser Anning's maiden speech, he made a statement that correctly identifies the logic behind the 2 + 2 = 5 premise and why it's included in Orwell's 1984.
If an individual could be induced to agree and state to others something they knew to be utterly false, such as black being white, then the party had achieved total moral and ethical surrender in the subject. Thus, to describe the so-called safe schools and gender fluidity garbage being peddled in schools as cultural Marxism is not a throwaway line, but a literal truth. Given that everyone knows that there are only 2 genders, if you can persuade to agree to you and advocate in support of the false claim that there are an infinite number of genders, then without realising it, you have surrendered your political soul.
So other than the prophetic insights into what technologies might exist in the future, what was the ideology of the party that Orwell was trying to warn us about? Eric Arthur Blair, otherwise known as George Orwell, completed 1984 in 1949, just 1 year before he died. He began writing it in 1947. 2 years earlier, in 1945, Clement Attlee defeated Winston Churchill to become British Prime Minister. Attlee was and remains the UK's longest-serving Labour leader and introduced socialist reform policies into the UK and adopted Keynesian economics. The Newspeak word that appears on the insignia of Oceania is INGSOC. It is Newspeak for English Socialism. Socialism was what Orwell was trying to warn us about. Those that read 1984 when it was published would have perceived a far-fetched, extreme and frighteningly totalitarian and absolutist account of a possible future dystopian socialist nightmare. A nightmare that the socialists of today are trying to make a reality, and using 1984 as an instruction manual rather than a warning.